Violent crimes involving multiple victims are not that uncommon. Why is the entire world captivated by this one? Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk about why I believe that the Idaho 4 crimes have captivated people from around the world, and why a lot of those people believe that there's foul play involved. Now we have to look at the big picture. In my opinion, if the Idaho 4 crimes were committed in a major city, let's say Chicago or Los Angeles, cities with a high population as well as a high crime rate, I don't believe that these crimes would have the same impact as they do since they were committed in a small town, such as Moscow, Idaho. There's no shortage of violent crimes that occur where the perpetrator takes the lives of multiple victims. But these crimes don't always make world news. A lot of the time, they don't even make the national news. So why the Idaho 4? There's a 24-year-old man in Harris, New Mexico, who just last month took the lives of his dad, his mom, his younger sister, and the family dog. And he did it with a firearm, a knife, as well as a meat tenderizing hammer. But I didn't see anything about that on the world news. There's another case that happened last month where a 15-year-old kid in Washington State took the lives of his mom and dad, along with 3 of his very young siblings. I didn't see this story on the world news. So there's a lot of violent crimes that occur in this country. So why is the Idaho 4 getting so much exposure? People have tried to rationalize the Idaho 4 crime as well as the investigation as not being odd at all. But it's obviously not sitting well with the public because there's tens of thousands of people, probably more, all over the world who are confused by the details of this crime. There's a reason that so many people are following the Idaho 4 crime so closely. If this case was as cut and dry as some people would like for us to believe, then there wouldn't be people all over the world who were captivated by it. Let's start with the basics, the crime. Law enforcement believes that one individual went into the King Roadhouse and took the lives of 4 college students with a single knife. That's the first red flag. How did one person get to all 4 victims on 2 separate levels without anyone running, without anyone alerting the others or fleeing the house? This was not a silent crime. This crime was brutal, and it was carried out with a knife. Whether or not all these roommates were sleeping before this attack occurred or not, nobody is sleeping through 4 people being brutally attacked with a knife and fighting for their lives. I don't believe that for 1 second. Unless this perpetrator is a bona fide ninja, these crimes are not happening quietly. Why didn't anyone call 911 while these attacks were occurring? That's red flag number 2. If everyone in this house was asleep, as law enforcement says that they most likely were, then this house would have been quiet, which means that when the screaming started and the crying started, it seems as though it would be more prominent. It seems as though all of the people in this house would hear this. People say that maybe this attacker delivered a strike that made these victims unable to scream out. Really? All 4 victims. This person got to all 4 victims and incapacitated all 4 of them before they were able to scream. That doesn't really make any sense to me. Dylan heard Kaylee say, "There's someone here," from upstairs, from above her on the 3rd level. She heard Xana crying from across the house. And she also heard a male voice say, "I'm going to help you," from across the house. But she didn't hear 4 people being brutally attacked and fighting for their lives. Now, 911 was not called until noon, 8 hours after law enforcement believes that these crimes began. That's red flag number 3. It just doesn't make sense to me that this perpetrator took the lives of 4 people all over this house on the 3rd level as well as the 2nd level, and he did it with a knife. And he walked upstairs, downstairs, across the house, out the door, and nobody saw anything out of the ordinary. Everything just looked normal when they walked out of their bedrooms. That just doesn't make sense. It seems as though Dylan or Bethany or anyone who was called to the house that morning would have seen that there was a major crime that just happened inside this house, that there was body fluid all over. Christy Gonzalez said that this crime scene was described to her as being very messy, that this perpetrator was very sloppy. Steve Gonzalez said that the coroner told him that there was one hell of a battle going on down there. So Dylan or Bethany, or the people called to the house, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary and think that maybe they should call 911. I mean, they called people over to the house, but they didn't call 911. Which leads us to red flag number 4. When Dylan and Bethany finally do get around to calling for help, they don't call law enforcement, they call their friends. So Dylan and Bethany were able to text each other back and forth, which we know that they did because investigators used the information from their phones to help build their timeline. So they were able to communicate with each other. And then that morning, they were able to call friends over to the house, but they weren't able to just bring themselves to call 911. They were aware and able enough to use their phones to talk to their friends, but unable to call 911. And talking about the timeline, that brings us to red flag number 5. Law enforcement originally stated that these crimes began around 2 a.m. Then they changed that, and they said that it happened between 3 and 4 a.m. Then they changed that, and they said that it happened between 4 and 4:25 a.m. Then in court paperwork, it came out that it was between 4 and 4:30 a.m. So there's a lot of discrepancies with this timeline. We have a DoorDash that's being delivered at 4 a.m., the exact time that law enforcement believes that these crimes began. So when these brutal crimes began, these brutal attacks began happening, there was a DoorDash driver who was delivering food to the front porch. We've been told that Xana was on TikTok at 4:12 a.m., right in the middle of when all of these violent crimes are occurring. So between 4 and 4:25 a.m. or 4 and 4:30 a.m., there's a lot going on inside this house. There's not only 4 people being attacked with a knife, but there's food being delivered. Xana's on TikTok. You know, there's so much going on between 4 and 4:30. It just really doesn't make a lot of sense when it comes to the timeline. Something else that happens between 4 and 4:25 a.m. is that Dylan continues to open and close her door throughout the entire time of the attacks. Her story changes a few times. Allegedly, she says that she opens her door and sees this intruder walking past her bedroom door. And after that, she goes into shock. But she also says that she didn't realize that anything bad had happened inside the house. So if she didn't realize that anything bad had happened inside the house, why did she go into shock? Now, Dylan also says that when she sees this intruder walk past her door, she goes back to sleep. So she hears Kaylee say, "There's someone here." She hears Xana crying. And she sees this strange person walk past her bedroom door. But then she just goes back to sleep and sleeps until almost noon. So was Dylan in shock, or did she go back to sleep? That brings us to red flag number 6. And this isn't in any order. This is just the order I put them in. But let's talk about red flag number 6. And that is that law enforcement assured the community that nobody else outside of this house was in any danger. Now, that's a pretty good indication that within just a few hours, law enforcement realizes, in my opinion, that these victims knew their attacker, that this was personal to these specific victims. It could also mean that law enforcement has someone in custody and that they don't want to release that information to the public because they might believe that there's other people involved and they don't want to tip them off that they've already caught someone. Or it could mean that this perpetrator is deceased. Because how would law enforcement be able to assure the community that nobody was in danger unless they knew either who this suspect was or where they were? How would law enforcement know that this perpetrator didn't have other targets that might be inside this community but outside of the house? So in my opinion, to come out just hours after entering this crime scene without knowing who the suspect is or where the suspect is and tell the people of the community that there's no danger, that everything's safe, in my opinion, that's irresponsible. It's dangerous. Now let's talk about red flag number 7. And that is that 3 weeks after these crimes occurred, Chief Fry from Moscow Police Department pulls up to the King Roadhouse, which is an active crime scene. And Moscow Police Department begins removing potential evidence from inside the crime scene. They begin loading it into a U-Haul truck. Now, I've researched a lot of crimes. I've looked at a lot of crimes. And I can honestly say that I have never heard of any police department pulling up to an active crime scene and removing the victim's belongings, which are potential evidence, loading them into a U-Haul truck, and just driving away with it. That makes absolutely no sense at all. And they actually made a spectacle out of this because they contacted the media and let them know that they were going to be doing this. So we all watched them basically pull up to this house in a U-Haul and begin removing potential evidence from an active crime scene. On the same day that Moscow PD removes the victim's belongings from an active crime scene, they also release a Be on the Lookout for a 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantra. And that brings us to red flag number 8. So when they put out this Be on the Lookout, they don't release actual photos of the actual car. They don't have any license plate information. They basically put out a stock photo of a white Hyundai Elantra between the years of 2011 to 2013. So this is a very common vehicle, very common. And they put this out there asking for tips from anyone who may know or owns a white four-door Hyundai Elantra, which basically they flooded their own tip lines, because who doesn't know somebody that owns a white four-door sedan? It's an extremely common car. And without an identification of the exact car, of course, you're going to get tens of thousands of tips from people who know someone who drives a white car. It didn't make sense that they would put that information out there like that, because of course, a lot of people in that town probably knew somebody that drove a four-door white Hyundai Elantra. Now, after they released this Be on the Lookout, the expert with over 30 years of experience comes out and says, actually, it could be a newer model Hyundai Elantra. It could be a 2015 white four-door Hyundai Elantra. I made a mistake. But right before that, they were touting about how this expert had so much experience. But then he gets the year of the car incorrect. Now, at this time, as far as we know, law enforcement doesn't even know who Bryan Kohberger is. But this expert changes the year of the car to 2015 white Hyundai Elantra, which just happens to be the year of Bryan Kohberger's Hyundai Elantra. So that's a pretty crazy coincidence. Red flag number 9, in my opinion, was when Moscow police chief says, you're just going to have to trust us. We're not going to release any information. Now, normally that would make sense because investigators don't want to compromise their investigation, and this investigation had just begun. But the problem is that when nothing is fitting into place and nothing seems to make sense, there's a lot of common sense issues in this investigation from the very beginning, and the police chief comes out and says, I know, it's a mess, but you're just going to have to trust us. In my opinion, that's a red flag. Now let's talk about, last but not least, the red flag number 10. And that is that, according to the Moscow fire chief, he stated that Moscow Police Department sent the fire department and EMTs away from the crime scene. They never entered the house. They didn't render aid to anyone who was at the house. They showed up, basically were told by Moscow Police Department that they weren't needed, and they left. That's odd. It was a quadruple homicide. Law enforcement obviously knew when Moscow Fire showed up that there were individuals inside this house who were deceased, but yet they sent away medical. So that's a big red flag for me. To me, all of these red flags may just be coincidental, but it looks as though things are being covered up. Now, I'm not saying that Moscow Police Department and these investigators and Idaho State Police are in, an organized effort to cover up all of this information. But it looks strange. It looks strange when so many aspects of this crime don't make sense. When people all over the world are noticing that the details of these crimes don't make sense, then in my opinion, something's wrong. When so many things don't add up, then it seems sketchy. When things don't seem to fit together, then people begin to question what's happening. With so many red flags, And there's many more than the ones I listed. I'm sure that you all could come up with many, many more red flags because there's a lot of them. But when all of these red flags begin to add up, it begins to look orchestrated. It begins to look like maybe this is all meant to confuse people. And I think that that's one of the reasons why people all over the world are following this crime. People are captivated by the Idaho 4 crimes. And it's not because there were 4 victims. It's not because these 4 victims were students. It's not because it happened in a small town. It's because the details surrounding this crime don't make sense. It's almost as though law enforcement in this case believed that this was all just going to fly under the radar, that nobody would be watching. But it turned out differently, and now everyone's watching. Now, something else that I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about this in my next video, is who besides the loved ones of the victims would be most affected by the Idaho 4 crimes? What organizations, what businesses, and what people would be affected the most negatively by the Idaho 4 crimes? We're going to talk about that in my next video. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I hope that you all had a great day, and we'll see you next time.